I like this definition of an action potential, a series of predictable changes. An action potential has a few steps that it goes through, and once it starts step one, it's going to proceed through all of the steps without going back and without stopping in the middle. These changes in membrane potential are predictable, and they are caused by the opening and closing of sodium and potassium channels, voltage gated channels. So wiggle your big toe. An action potential like a wave just left your brain and traveled down your spinal cord, out your sciatic nerve, and moved finally to your toe muscle. That is a long distance from your brain to your toe. In fact, for certain movements, there is one long neuron that leaves the brain and travels all the way out to the muscle. Have you ever held a rope between you and another person, kind of like how you'd set up for jumping rope? And while you're standing there, you create this wave in the rope that moves through it to the person on the other end. As that wave travels through the rope goes up and down. And that is pretty much the same for a potential. As an action potential moves through a cell membrane, or it moves through a neuron instead of a rope, it involves these ups and downs in voltage rather than the physical up and down. We have seen these terms, maybe this graph before, when we talked about how a motor neuron excites a skeletal muscle fiber. Now, and for the rest of this class, we will speak about these terms in application to neurons only. Skeletal muscle is like a dead end. It can receive an action potential, but it can't give that action potential to another cell. Neurons can receive an action potential and give an action potential to another cell. So let's review. Let's review for a moment. A neuron, it sits or it chills out at the resting potential. And we have set the resting potential in our class to be -70. And of course, this is measured in millivolts. Down here on the x-axis would be milliseconds, which obviously I don't know how to spell. Okay, so a neuron sitting or chilling out at its resting potential of -70, it's negative because there are tons of proteins in a cell. This side of the first hill on this graph represents depolarization. In this process, the cell is becoming more positive, and this results from the influx of sodium. So the cell gains sodium cations, and of course, those sodium cations make the cell a little bit more positive. This side of the hill right here is called repolarization, right? Because if you depolarize a cell membrane, then you have to repolarize, right? We depolarized, now we are repolarizing it back to the resting potential. In repolarization, sodium channels open. In repolarization, potassium channels open, and potassium cations move out of the cell. So the cell is losing positives, and thus it becomes more negative again. Hyperpolarization is also defined as the cell becoming more positive, but the difference is that hyperpolarization occurs when the cell is below the resting potential, and therefore this is attributed to the opening of potassium channels. Any and all channels that we are referring to here are voltage gated. Those are the channels that open in an action potential. I know you're saying, Amy, but how does the depolarization start if these are all voltage gated? I know. Depolarization associated with a local potential opens up ligand-gated channels. If we can open up enough of them, then we can start opening up voltage-gated channels in an action potential. We've designated -70 as the resting potential. Now, all the time, a neuron is getting poked and prodded by other neurons. So a neuron is always experiencing some degree of depolarization, repolarization, and hyperpolarization that you can see right here on this graph in all of these different areas. And it's going through these changes in membrane potential from the opening of ligand-gated channels, not voltage. The little changes in voltage are called graded or local potentials. Okay, so now, if one of these local potentials becomes large enough to hit a specific voltage value, then it's going to start opening up voltage-gated channels and become an action potential, right? So right here, if we are able to open up enough ligand-gated channels, then the action potential will proceed through its series of predictable changes. What's happening in the neuron here is that the neuron is going through local potentials, and one of them is big enough to allow the action potential to go over the axon hillock and propagate down the axon. Remember that this area right here, the axon hillock, is an area of resistance. The value at which voltage passes the axon hillock is called threshold. And we're going to use -50 as our threshold. I find that students constantly get threshold and resting potential mixed up. So make sure that you have a nice statement as to which one of them is. The threshold is the voltage at which we're going to have an action potential and there is no turning back. When a neuron hits threshold, like I said, there's no going back. An action potential will happen. I used to live in a rental in Trumansburg, and we had a washing machine that was older than me. It had a dial, and the dial only turned in one direction. So, like, let's say you had a wet towel that you just wanted to spin dry. No, that washing machine would only let you rinse and spin, not just spin. So using the dial, you had to advance through pre-wash, wash, just to get to the rinse. There was a predetermined sequence. That was the only way that washing machine worked, in a predetermined sequence. And action potentials are kind of like this. You get all of the steps of an action potential all of the time. There's no going back. There is no stopping at step 2 or step 3 or whatever step is not the last step. All of the steps of an action potential occur in the same sequence every time. This is what is called the all or nothing principle. When threshold is hit, the all or nothing principle takes over, forcing the neuron to go through all of the steps of an action potential. There are specific steps to an action potential. Different books, different websites, different teachers, even me in 2 different classes, might give you a different number of steps, but the sequence, it is always generally the same. So let's just make some hard, fast rules here so then we can explore them in a little bit more detail when we look at different neurotransmitters. Okay, so this down here is milliseconds, this over here is millivolts, and what we start out with the neuron kind of just chilling at the resting potential, and it's being a little bit depolarized and repolarized, but nothing substantial. And then suddenly there are some neurotransmitters that connect to the ligand-gated channels in a dendrite. And these neurotransmitters open up those ligand-gated channels, allowing sodium to flux into the cell, and it makes the cell more positive. That's step one right there. So now at this point, there are two things that can happen. First, the neuron could not hit threshold and just go back to resting potential. That's one possibility. Second, the cell could hit threshold and go through all the steps of an action potential. If enough ligand-gated channels open, we will depolarize the cell enough to get over threshold. Once threshold is hit, we're now going to go all the way up to positive 30 millivolts by opening up not some, but opening up every single voltage-gated sodium channel is opened up as we depolarize the cell. So these first two steps are about depolarization, but the first step below threshold involves ligand-gated channels. The second step above threshold involves voltage-gated channels. And this would be number 2. Okay, so now the cell has opened up all of the sodium channels that it could possibly open. This means that we're here at the top of the peak. If another stimulus came at the top of the peak, the neuron would be like, yeah, I can't have another action potential. All my sodium channels are open. I couldn't even make myself more positive if I wanted to. And this is the same situation as when I say to you, well, could you study just 1 more hour a day? And you look at me and you say, Amy, there are only so many hours in the day. I am using as many as I can. So we've depolarized the neuron now. We have to repolarize it, right? We can't let it sit at positive 30. In order to repolarize the cell, we now have to open potassium voltage-gated channels. Potassium cations will be leaving the cell, and the cell will start to become more negative in an effort to get back to the resting potential. As soon as those sodium channels start to close, the neuron, it could have another action potential. But in this slide, we're just going to consider what happens with one action potential. Unfortunately, the neuron overshoots the resting potential. And this little area here is called hyperpolarization. This is when some of the potassium channels stay open even though we've hit resting potential. And I'm sorry, I'm terrible with like numbering steps because I just can't commit. So we overshoot the resting potential, and that's okay. The neuron it's just going to use the sodium-potassium pump to get back to resting potential, right? It's this pump that it uses to maintain resting potential. Remember that the pump is going to return 2 potassium cations to the inside of the cell while removing 3 sodium cations. And this imbalance means that the pump can have the overall effect of making the cell to keep its resting potential.